Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody, whatever part of the world you're currently listening to our video blog. Thought I go out for a quick walk. I've been cooped up in the house for several days because it's been raining, so I didn't really get to stretch my legs as much the last few days. So I figure I enjoy the short time that the sun's going to be out for today. I heard there's going to be some thunderstorm coming up, so I figured take advantage of this break in the cloud. With that said, I hope you're all doing well. Apologize, I haven't been able to do a lot of video blogs lately just because of my projects, but I'll try to catch up as much as I can in the next few days pertaining to the current affairs happening in the US and abroad. As most of you are probably aware of, there's two very important upcoming elections coming up in Romania and Poland, and the candidates that are leading are both of them are actually no-name candidates. They're just simply opposing the pre-existing conditions in their country, going against the elites and typical class of politicians, the well-known politicians in their country, just because of the current situation in Ukraine, the quagmire that's happening in Eastern Europe, where many of the Western European countries are still interested in, basically extending this war between Russia and Ukraine. Matter of fact, Macron, Steinmeier, and Merz, the new Chancellor of Germany, went to Kiev, okay, folks, and had a powwow there with Zelensky. And so what I call those opposition leaders that are going against them are the coalition of the willing that are interested in ending the war between Russia and Ukraine. So, yeah, especially if Poland ended up supporting an anti-war politician, and also Romania. If that were to be the case, then they can align themselves with, Orban and Fico in Slovakia and Hungary to basically oppose any further escalation of the war between Russia and Ukraine. So, and obviously, the war, even if it were to stop, have already done a lot of geopolitical damage to the region, even if it were to stop today, just because of the overall headbanging and, rift that was created by this war that shouldn't have even happened. Basically, it created an environment of mistrust and animosity among European countries over Ukraine, over a war that shouldn't have even happened, right, folks? That's the stupidity of it all, is that there's it was pretty quiet in Europe back in 2020, because of the pandemic, and then soon after the pandemic, all this garbage started to manifest itself. And so now, even if the war was to end, it would have sowed this, animosity and mistrust among European countries, okay, over Ukraine. So that tells you that not only was the war so, destructive, it also destabilized the political and market situation of the region and the continent. All right, folks? So they didn't really think about any of this prior to engaging the Russians. So now they're basically put themselves in a really bad position, geopolitical-wise, in Europe, even after the war was to end. Yeah, even if it were to end today, like I was saying, the rift and animosity and mistrust among European countries will basically continue on. Yeah, anyway, that's the situation right now, right? So it's unfortunate, but what can you do when the wrong people are in charge? When, you know, when you have politicians that have no business running a country, you create a lot of problems and confusions and anger, mistrust in a country. If you're that type of politician that is so egotistical that you forget why you're even in office. Okay, folks? So anyway, I just thought I'd put this out there, because even if the war, like I said, were to stop today, it kind of created a domino effect in which you know, people have misaligned themselves and mistrusted each other, created confusion and ambiguity among decision makers. So that's just the reality of today's world. Luckily, and I say this fairly you know, strictly, that we have a new administration in the Oval Office who is fed up and tired with this war. I am so thankful, regardless of what party it is or who it is, that we have an administration that wants the war to basically end. The guy's riding on his rim there. He's got a flat tire, but he's keep on driving on. Anyway, folks, yeah, so like I was saying, I'm glad that this new administration is anti-war and is ready to, you know, walk away and just say it quits regarding the conflict between Ukraine and Russia. In all reality, the Russians wouldn't have even invaded Ukraine had the Ukrainians left those, you know, territories that sided with the Russians during the referendum alone. Had they left them alone and stopped attacking them in 2021, none of this war would have been happening. None of it would even be an issue today. But during the time Zelensky was running for office, his campaign promise, number one campaign promise, was to reunify Ukraine with those territories that voted to side with the Russians. So they had a referendum. It wasn't like they decided. Okay, but many of the countries in the West, specifically the United Nations, didn't see it as a legitimate, you know, election. Which, to me, if the people living in Ukraine have decided to side with the Russians because of their experience living in Ukraine, then who is the United Nations or any other country there, for that matter, to say what's legit or not? If the people that are experiencing the situation, the hardship, and the marginalization and discrimination in Ukraine against an ethnic population that wants to be part of Russia, then who is the world to say no to that? That's not our call. We don't have to, you know. So we simply do not need to participate if people are voted to side with the Russians with their free will, a democratic process through election. Who are we to tell them what to do and who to vote for? So anyway, going back to Zelensky's, you know, campaign. The whole time he was campaigning, he was telling the Ukrainian population that he was going to reunify those territories that sided with the Russians during the referendum. And guess what? That's what he tried to do in 2021. Okay? The referendum took place in 2014, and they sided with the Russians because they feel they're more Russian ethnically, and the way they see their culture, society, education, language, religion is more in line with Russia. So that's what they did. He voted with to unite with Russia. Okay, folks. So anyway, going back to what could happen after the war, even if the war were to end today, my assessment is the market's going to rally. I mean, it's going to rally big time, but the geopolitical animosity would persist, and that in itself is something to be very mindful about, and needs to be closely watched by the financial world, the markets around the world and in Europe. Make sure that an economic crisis doesn't manifest itself in the region. So that's pretty much what I'm seeing that could precipitate after the war was to end. Obviously there's going to be another election in France and in Britain in the next couple of years. So we're hoping that whoever wins in those elections are not hardliners that are pro-Ukraine, to the extent that they would continue to support Zelensky. Technically, Zelensky's mandate ended last year, in May actually, of last year, but no one's talking about it in the Western world, no one's talking about it in the media, but technically his mandate ended May of 2024. All right, folks, so basically Stammer, Macron, and the new Chancellor Merz in Germany are supporting a ex-president that is technically not even within his rights to call the shots for the country, but still they're still supporting him. Her advice and instructions of the European Union in Brussels. Okay, so they don't care if Zelensky's no longer in charge. They just want to make sure that they continue to fuel this flame and basically increase their return on their investment, political return on their investment, because they're getting paid more to support Ukraine based off of their taxes. Okay, folks, because their taxpayers have been bamboozled to support a war that could have been prevented. Okay, and so the more war there is, the more this instability in the region, the increase in pay these politicians, okay, are ending up racking in funds, because they're basically gaining other support and sources of funds. All right, so anyway, that's the overall situation right now, folks, and I thought I kind of bring it up to your attention, just have you kind of reflect on what I'm talking about. So thanks for joining me, those that lie in on this video blog. Thank you for walking out here in the park with me. But yeah, so I just thought I briefly point some of these things out. Okay, so Poland and Romania will go through an election process. For Romania, it's actually round 2, because I know the previous election back in December, the results of the presidential election last December, and canceled the following round to that election. And now they're having a repeat this Sunday. And for Poland, it's actually their official election season taking place, and the no-name politician being supported by Washington, and also by the front runner in the Romanian presidential election. He's actually helping campaign for the Polish candidate that is going against Tusk. So he's they're tag teaming, they're joining force and increasing their overall capacity to influence hearts and minds in their countries. So, but unfortunately, the damage was already there. Many of these countries have created some things that are very irreversible in geopolitics, and mainly that's mistrust of each other. If you guys look into the history of Europe, these countries have never really trusted each other from the very beginning. Obviously because of history, because of kingdoms and principalities that took place. They never really trusted each other to begin with, from the very beginning of time, up until they started developing their governments and political system. They were still banging heads. Okay, Europe has, if you look at Europe, the size of the freaking continent is tiny, but it's populated by a diverse group of culture, people, ideas, worldview, capacities, languages, even though the size of Europe is so small. And now, because of what's going on in the region, things are even getting worse regarding fragmentation of Europe. The European Union was created to unite Europe initially. Before there was the European Union, where there were the Western coal mining industries countries that were mostly generating coal for the whole continent and selling them to Eastern European countries. Before there was the rise of Nazism in Europe, in Germany. So yeah, that was pretty much what it was then. The coalition of coal mining industries and countries of Europe. And then they realized after World War II, it's best to join force and prevent war to ever happening in Europe again. So they united Central and Eastern Europe with the Western European countries, so that they can trade and do business with each other, educate each other, have freedom of movement. They can work wherever they want to work in Europe. It's part of the European Union market, single market. Okay, experiment. And that kind of came on crashing down when this issue with Ukraine started to precipitate, because many of the Eastern European countries are basically they're fighting among each other now. They don't know who it is to support, and yeah, that's just what was going on from the very beginning back in 2014 doing. So they were basically trying to figure out who to decide with and to what extent. They were banging heads among themselves during the Maidan revolution to see whose fault. Was it the Russians or was it the Ukrainians? But before the Maidan revolution, there was already fighting going on between Russia and Georgia. And basically the reason for that is because the Georgians wanted to side with the West. And given that there's so close proximity to Russia, the Russians were pretty rattled by the idea that Georgia might be joining the Western countries. But I can't really blame them. Oh, check this out. Bunch of turtles right there, just enjoying that log. The snapping turtles right there. See it? That's cool. Just hanging out. So what I was saying is that the European countries didn't know who to side with, because basically they know that if they were to take Georgia's side, then the war between Georgia and Russia will continue on. And the same thing that would happen to Ukraine and Russia. But what they didn't realize is that most of it were economically driven. The Ukrainians, the Georgians, and many of these countries in the Eastern European region were basically, feeding off of the Russian economy. They were getting a lot of their foreign direct investment from Russia, and trade was open and unrestricted between Russia and Ukraine and other markets up until it's time for them to pay up. So the Russian basically, gave them ultimatums. They, tried to work with them to repay their debt. And when the Ukrainians realized that there's no way for them to repay the Russians, they decided to side with the European Union. So that's just the reality of things. And it's an unfortunate reality because, like I said, it could have been prevented. Our folks had people with sense and calm, predisposition, got on the negotiation table and said, okay, let's figure out an amicable solution pertaining to this, war between Russia and Ukraine. But that didn't happen, unfortunately. There were supposed to be peace talks weeks after the invasion took place in Istanbul, Turkey, and they still, they ripped up the contract basically and said, no, we're not going to be negotiating with Russia as long as Ukraine's in power. I mean, not Ukraine, but Putin's in power, sorry. So, that's the reality of the overall situation in that part of the world, folks. So, whatever you hear in the national news is most likely anti-Russia. They're spinning the narrative to support the agenda of the European Union and the Biden-Harris administration at that time. They didn't want to really influence hearts and minds to the point that the country would side with the Russians, even though that would have been the prudent and wise choice for any country regarding this war. But, whoever's got money and power, gets to dictate, unfortunately. And thousands of lives have been snuffed out because of this war. Very preventable war. Oh, look, there's a robin. It's pretty nice. Anyway, that's the reality of the overall situation. Okay, and the longer the war persists, the more obvious it is that Ukraine was at fault. The longer that information and facts manifest itself, the more obvious it is to know who was the instigator of this war. Okay, folks. So basically, not only the Ukrainians, allowed for their people to be destroyed and mowed down and sent to the meat grinder, they now lost the narrative of, who was at fault, because the longer they keep this war going, the more obvious it is who actually instigated the war, and which are the Ukrainians, unfortunately. And so it spiraled down out of control. They thought they were gonna glide through it, but obviously that didn't happen. After the Biden-Harris administration left office, all the dirt and garbage that precipitated leading up to the war started to manifest itself. Not in the U.S., market, not in the U.S. society, but around the world via social media. And this ties our platform, the utilization of the social media platform in economic development, faceconomics, to world affairs, geopolitics, and the globalization of the market, around the world using the social media platform. All right, folks, so we're talking about things that can no longer be kept under wraps. In the past, many of these governments, the way that they clean up their mess is they silence whoever it is they oppress, whoever it is they violated the rights they violated, whoever it is that called them out. Okay, those days are over, or at least in certain occasions, because the social media platforms, the giants there, are still very politically driven, and they basically silence those narratives that are not in line with the political agenda that they support. So in a way, we're still having to deal with, you know, the silencing, the marginalization, the oppression, the victimization, you know, the civil rights violation, human rights abuse going on, and it's happening, you know, in both real world and in the virtual world online. So yeah, folks, the complexity of today's world has been magnified. It's like 8 times more complex. Okay, folks, and that's just gonna get even worse until we have influencers out there, until we have social media figures and influencers, podcasters, YouTubers that want to fight back. Now they can fight back obviously using their platform, but sometimes their silence, if their narrative is not aligned with the prevailing structure and prevailing narrative of the social media giant organization that's hosting their platform. So unfortunately, we still have a long road to go, and until these social media giants are held accountable, nothing will change. You know, last January I actually started a campaign to hold Mark Zuckerberg accountable for silencing the voice of those that were going against the Biden and Harris administration's narrative and political agenda. You know, Facebook, or Meta, was a culprit and was a participant, okay, of silencing and IDing those marchers. January 6th on Capitol Hill, they ID'd every single marchers that participated, even though they didn't storm any of the federal buildings. But Facebook used AI, artificial intelligence, and their platform basically to ID them. All right, folks. And so they were reprimanded and arrested because of Facebook, because of Meta. And Mark Zuckerberg allowed it to happen. Okay, he's a multi-millionaire. He could have hired an army of lawyers to protect the rights, civil rights, and freedom of speech of those marchers. Now, I'm not saying the ones that were violent, the ones that destroyed, you know, federal government property and all that stuff, stormed the buildings. I'm not saying they should be protected, but the ones that were outside, that were ID'd by Facebook, were victimized by the platform. All right, folks. So anyway, think about it. You know what I'm saying. Let me know what your thoughts are. Do you agree, disagree with what I'm talking about? I need to know that. All right, folks. So with this said, thank you again for joining me. My name is Almin. I'm the concept author of Faceconomics, the utilization of the social media platform in economic development worldwide. You know, I am truly humbled by you guys supporting us and letting people know about us. And you know, we're not that famous, and we're still building our capacity. So we are very thankful of you wanting to support us and listening to our voice. You know, all it really takes is one person. All it takes is one light to brighten up this world. I'm not saying I'm that light. Okay, I'm not saying I'm that big of an influencer, but I do feel that everyone should advocate for, you know, democracy, freedom of speech, equality, okay, among people. So yeah, that's what I believe in, and I hope you do too. Anyway, yeah, so I've decided to go on this walk, and I've got about 15 minutes to go. And so I really like the idea that the new administration is evening out the playing field when it comes to democracy. This new administration has went and held the deep state accountable, and they're still doing that. They're going to expose the people behind the deep state, and they're going to make sure that whoever it is that tried to ruin the lives of people by hiding online and attacking people and destroying their lives are held accountable. So hopefully you'll start hearing in the news who are these people behind the deep state, how they manage to influence and destroy the lives of Americans and even people from around the world, okay, just because they don't agree with their narrative. So basically, they were the dictators, the oppressors, and the tyrants hiding behind the internet. And eventually, the Trump administration will expose them, just like what the FBI is trying to do now, just like what Pam Bondi's office is trying to do now, the Department of Justice. All these people will be held accountable, and we will know, the world will know how they did what they did and why they did what they did, and the punishment that is awaiting for them. Okay, not only did they violate public trust like Mark Zuckerberg's company did, Meta, they violated public trust, they ruined a lot of people during the Biden-Harris administration. Okay, folks, these deep state, whoever is the head honcho, will basically have to answer to the people, to the public, whose lives they've ruined. All right, folks, and it's definitely overdue. This should have been done a long time ago, but unfortunately we didn't have the current administration to enforce, you know, the legalities of it all, because the Biden-Harris administration were the ones that was orchestrating it and basically you know, benefiting from it. All right, folks, so time will judge these people. Okay, and I am a firm believer of justice. Okay, everyone on this planet is, you know, they're subservient to justice. They have to abide by the law of the land. So justice will come, and he will judge the evildoers of this world, the illegal minds and hearts that have been destroying people, okay, of this world. That's coming. Alright, folks, so with this said, my name is Al Mina. I'm the concept author of Faceconomics, the utilization of the social media platform in economic development around the world. And we started off with the, Eastern European politics. And what I'm going to do is end it with Eastern European politics. So I started working in Eastern Europe back in 2008. That is just a couple of years after Romania joined the European Union and NATO. Prior to 2008, they removed their dictator, Ceausescu. And so when Ceausescu was removed, Romania was operating, verbatim, the same structure as the communist, countries around the world would, using the same, roadmap. They were oppressing their people. They were basically suppressing, freedom of speech and dissent, and destroying the market economy of their country. Okay, folks? And that's why many European countries supported, the ousting of a dictator, Ceausescu, after the fall of the Berlin Wall. So many of the Eastern European countries, when the Berlin Wall collapsed, were basically protected by Russia. They were protected by the communist countries at that time. And when the Berlin Wall disappeared, many of the Eastern European countries decided that they're no longer interested in becoming the puppet of the USSR. At that time, there was a United Soviet Socialist Republic. So when that took place, Russia realized that it needs to have a new government model. They weren't going to be able to keep all their satellite states. And the only way for them to survive as a society, when all their states basically became fragmented and became a sovereign country, was to figure out a way to bring them back. And the only way to bring them back was to become more democratic. They wanted to create a democracy that is identifiable to that of the West. But that didn't happen because they were labeled by the West as a communist state. And during that time, as much as they were trying their very best to become westernized and become a democracy, they couldn't quite fully become one because of the labels that had been attached to them as a society by the West. All right. So fast forward to the year 2025. After decades of, basically rebuilding the Russian government, decades of influencing hearts and minds of the Russian public, they are becoming more democratic than any other countries of the Euro-Asian region. Okay, folks? But since they've been isolated and singled out by the West and by the media, by the press, guess what stuck? The communist Russia model. Because we never really gave the Russians any platform to, introduce the new government structure for their country to the West. And so, in a way, we made sure that they're silenced and they stay in the past, even though they were advancing and evolving into a more democratic society. We just basically made sure that the narrative sticks, because that's the only way to isolate them, is by basically, putting them in the corner and letting them stay there because they've been bad boys, 80 years ago. And so we're basically ostracizing them and penalizing them for what took place 80 years ago. We're not crediting the Russians for all the changes that happen in their society, in their government. Because if we did that, then we won't have a boogeyman anymore. There's no one to blame. There's no one to point fingers at. Okay? And that's just the typical modus operandi of those that are simply not interested in, having some sort of diplomatic relations with people. An amicable relationship building strategy. Okay? Because in all reality, given this war right now between Russia and Ukraine, the European Union wants to keep the narrative alive, which is the Russians wants to destroy Europe. All right, think about this. If the Russians wants to destroy Europe, they have more people, more professional military and weapons to engage the whole continent of Europe. They have more professional soldiers than Ukraine or Germany or any European countries. But that's not happening. When they went into Ukraine, they didn't even sack the whole country. They just basically took over those territories that sided with them and protected those territories, and that's where all the fighting was taking place. All right, folks. They went to Kiev a couple of weeks after the invasion and pulled out. Just a matter of days, 3 days later, they pulled out because they weren't interested in taking over Ukraine. They could have easily, occupied Ukraine, the whole country. The Russian could have easily, saturated the whole market of Ukraine, and that would have been the end of the war. But they didn't. And in a way, it was also their fault for not doing that, because now the Ukrainian Zelensky regime managed to bring additional forces in terms of weaponry into Ukraine. And that's why it's imperative for people to know this, because the war should have been done with, over, ended up back in 2022. All right. But because of the Biden administration, which supported the misaligned position of Zelensky regarding the war, it precipitated the more death and destruction of the Ukrainian population. And guess what's going on in Kiev? They gave a special marking. I think it's a plaque, or it might have been a monument honoring Biden, which basically orchestrated the destruction of Ukraine and the death of Ukrainians. Had they told the Russians that America will not engage, will not support Ukraine, solve it diplomatically, it would have been over within weeks. Okay? But that wasn't the case. What we did as a country was basically tell Zelensky that we're going to give him a blank check and do whatever he wants to do with it. And guess what he did? He took them on, with that offer. And so many people died because of it. Their infrastructure, their beautiful historical buildings and monuments gone, because in a war they will be the target. Okay? And so, folks, you need to wake up. There's this thing that the Democrats says you need to be woke. Yes, you need to be woke, but not that with the narrative that they're telling. It's that with the narrative that you basically put together in your head, not be like mindless sheets. You have to analyze, you have to connect the dots, you need to do your research, understand the situation, and make some sort of sense out of it. That's what people should do and ought to do. All right, there's this wokeism narrative. It's not really being wokeism, it's just being able to use your common sense, your head. And I think that's what the Trump administration is trying to promote. Now, as many of you know, I run as an independent. I didn't really support neither parties when I was a U.S. Senate candidate. So I'm talking about as an independent candidate, okay, an independent political analysis. And that's what I'm sharing with you now. With this said, folks, thank you so much for your time walking with me and, reflecting on what I'm trying to share with you. With this said, looking forward to our next conversation. Take care. Bye.